Hello and welcome to the SMU Video Archive Series. In this series, we interview members of the SMU community who can provide insight into the history of the university and especially from the perspective of their time here. I'm James Brooks, and today we have with us Professor Emeritus Fred Wendorf, an archaeologist of great distinction. Fred, let's kind of begin at the beginning, and you've been an archaeologist almost all your life, and why don't you talk a little bit about how you first got hooked?
Well, I wanted to be an archaeologist all my life. It took me a while to do it, but I got interested in Indian artifacts when I was about 8 years old, and 3 or 4 of us boys who were over in Taos, Texas, where I was born and raised, went out to look for some Indian arrowheads, and I found a few, and that started it. And gradually my interest increased over the years, and I think by the time I was 12 or 13 years old, I knew I wanted to be an archaeologist.
Well, then you finished high school in Terrell and
I finished high school in
went
Terrell.
to the University of Arizona.
I went to the University of Arizona.
And you went to the University of Arizona, as I recall, because they had one of the few remaining horse cavalry ROTC units.
Well, I'm not sure that's why I went out there, but I went out there, in fact, to study with Emil Hari, who I hadn't met, but whom I knew was an eminent archaeologist, and he was someone who came very highly rated by those who I'd consulted. Actually, the horse cavalry thing was something I got into because I was interested in the military, and as you may know, I enlisted in the Army when I was 18 and got quite a bit of military before it was over.
Yes. We'll talk about that in just a minute, but continuing on the Arizona business, clearly the University of Arizona has been a very, very strong department in archaeology for a very long time, probably from very nearly the beginning of the university, I would guess, because of the tremendous archaeological heritage that the state has.
That's correct. They, before Hari, there was a man named Cummings who was the head of the archaeology program and head of the State Museum there in Tucson at the university. And he brought Hari in. And I think really from that point on it became truly a nationally recognized program.
Mm-hmm. Well, you were starting to talk about the military, and I know that you were active in World War II in the 10th Mountain Division, as I recall.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And you saw quite a lot of action in the early days of the war in the Italian campaign.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And you were at Riva Ridge.
That's right. I made the climb up Riva Ridge, and then 2 or 3 other battles before my number came up. Yes.
Yeah, and you were wounded and then came back and were in recuperation for quite a while.
Spent 2 years in the military hospital. It's not quite as bad as it sounds like that because by the time I got back, I was ambulatory, and after the first 6 months in the hospital, there really wasn't much they could do for me, and they said that if you wanted to go and do something, we'll give you 3 months leave of absence, and you come, and we just want you to agree to take physiotherapy every day while you're away at a military post near wherever it is you go. And so I took a series of those 90-day leaves, and I went to various schools and continued my education.
Well, now, had you graduated in archaeology from Arizona before you went into the service?
No, I had just turned 18 and I was a junior.
So you came back and finished your degree at Arizona?
Yes.
And then you went on to graduate school at Harvard?
That's right. I went there in 1948, in the fall of 1948, and I finished my doctoral studies and exams in 1950. But it was until 1953 before I had my dissertation finished and got my PhD.
And what was your dissertation on?
I had, that's probably a pretty interesting point about my background. When I first got out of the Army, that first summer I went with Emil Hari to Point-au-Pines, Arizona, where they had a field school in archaeology, and I got my first real experience in archaeology there. And I had written to Harold L. Colton, who was the director of the Museum of Northern Arizona in Flagstaff, and asked him if I could please come up and study with him and look at some pottery after I'd finished at Point of Pines, and he wrote me back and said that yes, to come on. And so my wife and I went on up there to the museum, and they provided me with a little shack to live in. And I went in, and Dr. Colton pulled out a few drawers of potsherds that were in boxes, and he said, "These are from the Petrified Forest National Monument, and we need to study them, and why don't you classify them?" And he said, and he turned and walked out. And it was a bit of a start, because every time I opened the box, they all look alike. And so finally he came back in the afternoon. He said, "Do you have any trouble?" And I said, "I surely did." So then he took a few minutes and showed me how he classifies pottery. And he was one of the fathers of ceramic typology in the American Southwest. And he had a profound impact on my life, because not only at that, 2 years later, when I was going to start my dissertation research, I wrote to him and asked him if he could help me work in the Petrified Forest. And he gave me a big grant of $500.
A lot of money in those days.
Well, we ran for 8 weeks on $500, and I rented an old pickup truck from a Ford dealer in Gallup, New Mexico, that he'd arranged, and I paid $75 for the use of that pickup truck. And it was, and then the second year he did get me a grant, not out of his pocket, but from the Colt Foundation, and they gave me, I think it was $1,200.
Well, let's move on and talk about your 4 years at Harvard.
2 years, really.
2 years, really, because you, like a lot of us in that period, you came out as an ABD.
Right.
Out of your residence.
Well, I was intending to go back after I'd finished my prelims and write my dissertation in Cambridge. But an accident occurred. Someone showed up that I had not expected. A man named Jess Nussbaum came in with some other gentlemen and flew into the Petrified Forest and circled my camp, and then went off and landed and came back to visit, and asked me if I would run a pipeline archaeology project that ran from Farmington, New Mexico to California. Now, this was the first time that anything of this sort had ever been done, to do archaeology ahead of a fast-moving construction project. And I hired 6 archaeologists, and 2 of whom were my students out there working with me. And they did the job.
Well, and that was important, because that kind of so-called salvage archaeology has become a standard operating procedure, and that was a path-breaking job that you had, because you set the patterns and the standards for much of what has followed.
Well, and it happened that it actually was the model for the highway archaeological salvage program that we started in New Mexico. After I had finished my work on the pipeline, I was offered a job at the Laboratory of Anthropology at the Museum of New Mexico in Santa Fe, just to be a research archaeologist, a curator. And one of the things that I did when I first went there, I took a leave right away and did another project for El Paso Gas Company. And on the way back, I was driving along Highway 66, and I noticed 3 or 4 Indian ruins that had been damaged by highway construction many years before. And shortly thereafter, I was invited to give a talk at a local Rotary Club or Kiwanis Club, I don't remember exactly which one. And I spoke up and said, at the end of my lecture, I talked about the pipeline project and how great it was. It was a national precedent, and what it would mean. And at the end of the lecture, I said, it's really too bad that we can't get our own government to live up to our laws as well as we get the private industry. And a few minutes later, after people were standing around talking to me and so on, and a few minutes later, a gentleman walked up to me and he introduced himself. My name is Spike Keller, and I'm the Bureau of Public Roads chief engineer for the state of New Mexico. He said, "I'd like to talk with you about your comments." Of course, I felt about that high, and because he was a very important politician in the state, and as well as an engineer. And it was arranged within a few moments that I would go with him the next day to meet with the chief highway engineer of the state of New Mexico, and we'd work out a problem. We'd work out a program on how it would work. And we did. And that became the sort of the model for all of the highway salvage archaeology programs now going on in every state.
Everywhere.
Every state in the union.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I knew from earlier conversations about that, and I thought it was really important to get that into the visual record.
That was a great break for a young man, you know.
Yeah, but you made the most of it. So. Well, let me return to Harvard, because it was at Harvard that you met a lot of people, but two people that in quite different ways had an important influence on your life. One was Kirk Bryan.
That's right.
And you might talk a little bit about him.
Well, Kirk Bryan was a Pleistocene geologist, geomorphologist, a professor at Harvard, who had an interest in archaeology, and a lot of his students who were geologists also did projects that related to Holocene or late Pleistocene. He got me interested in the problems about the environment and the sedimentary settings in which archaeological sites occur. And in fact, he came and spent part of the summer with me. The summer he died, he left my camp and went to Wyoming, and I believe died there a couple of weeks later. He was really a major impact on my life.
And there was another person there, and we'll return to Kirk Bryan a little bit more in a minute, because the two are kind of interrelated. That person was another graduate student named Rushdie Saeed.
That's right. Well, another student in that class sat next to me was a young Egyptian named Rushdie Saeed, and you know, he was a foreigner and I was a Texan, so I was also a foreigner, and he and I struck up a friendship, a classroom friendship, and so on. Very nice young man, very, very bright. Now lives in Maryland.
But you might go on and talk about the importance of Rushdie Saeed to all of us, really.
Well, several years later, I guess that would have been 1949, or yes, something like that, when I took that course with Kirk Bryan, and Rushdie was in it. And I was in Egypt in 1962 to begin the archaeological salvage efforts in the Aswan Reservoir, doing with the prehistory in the reservoir. We had large grants from the State Department and from the National Science Foundation to study the prehistory. And I had gone to the Egyptian antiquities people and had interviewed the head of the antiquities organization, and he was mad as a hopper. He did not want all that money going to study prehistory. He wanted it to be spent on Egyptology and things that he was interested in. And he told me, I'm not too sure that I had sent him my proposal because, and I outlined in the proposal that I was going to live in tents and going to drive vehicles in the desert, and I had made those arrangements in my own mind because I had met Bagnall 2 or 3 years before that, and Bagnall was the commander of the Long Range Desert Group, but before he was the
in World War II.
In World War II, and before that, as a young lieutenant in Egypt, he had organized his fellow officers and men that were bored and living around Cairo, that they would go into the desert, and he learned how to drive in the desert in those old Model T Fords with 33.5 tires on them, and they developed the sun compass, and sand tracks, and many of the things that we now still use in working in the desert. And he had informed me that it was, you know, clearly possible to work in the desert. Well, the head of the antiquities organization said, I certainly won't approve of you working living in the desert in tents and using cars. He said, if I give you a permit, and I'm not sure I'm going to, if I give you a permit, you're going to have to live in a houseboat and use camels to go into the desert. Well, somewhat dejected, I left him and went to the University of Cairo, where I was meeting with a botanist there that was going to help us a bit. And there was a young man sitting over on the table when I got there, and I didn't pay him much attention. And in a little while, he walked up to me and said, "Fred, do you remember me? My name is Rushdie Saeed. We sat together in Kirk Bryan's classes." Well, it turned out, and I invited him almost immediately after a few minutes of conversation what he was doing. He was a very unhappy assistant professor at the University of Cairo in geology, and I invited him to join us as a geologist on our project, and he accepted quickly. Well, it was one of the best things I've done in my life, because a few weeks later, he was appointed to the Parliament by Nasser, where he met another fellow by the name of Sadat, who made him chairman of the Appropriations Committee of the Parliament. And very shortly thereafter, the head of the Antiquities Organization came to Rushdie and said that we need more money. We have all these foreign expeditions coming in, and we've got to have more antiquities people. We have to have this and that and the other. And Rushdie said, I've sympathized with you, and I'm really supportive, and I will get you some more money. And he said, now I'd like to have you help me with something of mine that I'm interested in. And he said, well, what, He said, well, I have this friend Wendorf. The guy's face fell, of course. And he said, we're working together. And his face came back up. and he said, we want to have a nice concession, and we want to be able to work in the desert, and we want to work with the Geological Survey out there and use cars and things of this sort. And he said, anything you want, Dr. Saeed. And the rest is history.
Well, to finish the rest, Rushdie then was extremely helpful to you all through the early and middle part of your work in Egypt, which
Absolutely.
ultimately went on for almost 40 years.
Until he left the Geological Survey.
That's right.
I think it was about 78, something like that.
And through you then, he was very helpful to a number of the rest of us, Claude Allbritton and myself, and became friends with all of us.
Yes, yes.
And that's been one of the really pleasant things in my life.
Yeah. He'll be pleased to hear that, by the way, and I'll be sure to tell him.
Well, please do. And we might even send him a copy of this tape. Back to Kirk Bryan. There's another connection that I think goes back to Kirk Bryan, and that was with an earlier person, a predecessor at Harvard, who had graduated with his doctorate in the late 30s, a person named Claude Allbritton.
Oh, Claude Allbritton is perhaps the most important figure in my life. He is truly a father figure to me, and I've had a lot of help from major people, and as you've already seen. But Claude and I had heard about Claude through my contacts with Bryan, but I had never met him. But I had the opportunity to study the Midland site out just west of, between Midland and Odessa, where a Pleistocene age human partial skeleton was found and recovered.
This is late Ice Age.
Yes, it's about 10 to 11,000 years old, I think. Associated with extinct fauna. And in looking around for people to help me do this project, I immediately thought of Claude Allbritton as someone who had been working in the Trans-Pecos area and who had done the basic stratigraphy of the dunes in that area, particularly the Monahans area. And he joined with Alex Krieger, who I got to help with the archaeology. He was the eminent Texas archaeologist at that time. And T. Dale Stewart at the National Museum to restore the skeleton. So that, and then several years later, Claude invited me to come to SMU.
Now at this time you were at Texas Tech or at the New Mexico Museum?
I was at the Museum of New Mexico in Santa Fe.
Yeah.
I was director there.
Yeah. And now talk a little bit, you've alluded to it, but talk a little bit about what went into the move which to my way of thinking, is one of the things that you often hear about in American academe, and I don't know of another instance where it has happened as clearly as it did with the move of you and your group from New Mexico, from Santa Fe to SMU. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, there was a small difference of opinion between me and the board there at the museum, and I was invited to go find someplace else to work. And I had rather large grants from the State Department and from the National Science Foundation to do the work in Nubia. And several of the people who were working with me there expressed the view that they'd like to come and work with me here. And let's finish the reports that we do on that project. And we had others at the museum who wanted to come also, but I didn't want to stretch my luck too far. I believe there were 8 of us who came, 8 plus me, and most of them stayed on. We were all set to. I will tell you that I came thinking I would stay 2 or 3 years, and I would move on, because I knew I was interested in research, and I didn't know that SMU would have much interest in that. Mm-hmm. And so after we all came here, and also I have to mention that we didn't know whether we were going to like Dallas or not.
Sure.
And it was right after the assassination of President Kennedy, and which also had a role in why they wanted us here. The people in the community, leaders in the community, realized that they needed to have a better worldwide experience here while they're among their students, and that they wanted to expose them to the world at large. And they saw us anthropologists as a means in which that might be accomplished. And so they readily agreed that those who wanted to come with me, and that I would recommend that they would take, and they would give them positions here on the staff. Well, when we'd been here about 2 years, I received an invitation to go back up east to a major university and become chairman of a department there. And when I went back to interview for them, I told them that I had 8 people that I needed to consider when this was going on, and the dean said, "Bring them along." And that was the good old days when departments were being expanded and so on. But I came back and I talked over with the people, and we all agreed that we really liked Dallas. By then we'd become adjusted to it, and we liked the way we'd been received by the community, and you know, the Dallas Morning News wrote an editorial welcoming us to Dallas, which was really a very important thing.
Well, it's the interesting thing to me was the fact that effectively a department of anthropology, really a department of archaeology, was bought lock, stock, and barrel and moved from one institution to another.
That's right. And
Claude gets credit for that.
Oh yes, he deserves it. It's he fought for us, and well, when after they said, my colleagues all said, if we can possibly persuade the university to allow us to have a PhD program, we'll be delighted to stay here if they'd like to keep us. And at that time, when we became a part of the Department of Sociology, and we were housed in a theology dormitory called Smith Hall. Yeah. And we brought in all these thousands and thousands of artifacts and had them in those hallways and in the rooms down there at Smith Hall. And it kept moving, doing something that we've done before. We moved down as our space needs increased. We kept going down in Smith Hall, and so we occupied also the first and second floor. I mean, the top floor and the second floor. But They said if we could possibly have that, we'd like to stay. And so I went to Neil McFarland, who was then the provost.
That's right.
And explained the whole situation to him and said, you know, we'd like to stay if its means could be paid for us to have a PhD program in anthropology. And we did not ask for a separate department. We just said we'd just like to be able to have that program.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I need a couple of weeks. And so about 10 days later, he called up and said, well, you got it. And I said, what? And he said, well, you got the separate department of anthropology. You got a PhD program. And you got the blessings from us to do anything you can find the money to do. And we went on from there.
Good.
I went to the head of the sociology department at that time, Martin King, and offered him, I said, we didn't really want to separate from you, and we'd be very happy to stay part of this sociology if you'd like to join us and we go together on this new PhD program. And he said, I need a few days to decide. So he went off and talked with his colleagues, and he came back and said, no. He said, the competition and the requirements that you're going to have in a PhD program will be more than we feel like we want to do. He made a big mistake.
Yeah, he did. It was an opportunity to build the whole thing.
Yes, we put him.
But you know, hindsight is always 20/20 in these things. Let me shift a little bit. I want to come back to Egypt a little bit later, but I'm trying to keep this synchronized chronologically, because when at the same time you were doing these things on one track, you were doing something else called Fort Berglund on another track.
Yes, it was.
And that's such an interesting story. I think it really goes back to your time at the New Mexico Museum.
Before that.
Well, I guess actually before that. Why don't you talk a little bit about that, because that has become so important to the university.
Well, it started with the head of the New Mexico Highway Department talking to me one day. I was then still a curator at the museum, and he said, I understand you're going to go to Texas Tech and teach. And I said, yes. And he said, well, you're going to need some place to bring your students so they can learn archaeology in New Mexico, aren't you? And I said, yes. And we were at a big party, a rather interesting party, and he said, well, he said, in a few days when I've sobered up, come see me. So I waited about a week or 10 days, and I called him up, and this was George Lavender, and I said, do you remember our conversation in Phoenix? And he said, oh yes. He said, come on out and let's talk. And so in essence he was saying, why don't you go up to Pot Creek where we have a logging operation. And he said, you know, I'm still trying to make my money, but my business partner up there is a man named Ralph Rounds, and he's got it. He's made his money. And he is very interested in history and archaeology. And he said, I think he will support you, but if he doesn't, I will provide you the money that you need to do this field school. And he said, why don't you think about this a little bit, and I'll arrange for you to meet with him when he comes to New Mexico next time. Well, he also, as I was leaving, he said, Rounds is very interested in finding an old Army post that's up there on this Rancho Rio Grande Grant. He's had several people come to look for it, and they will find it. You might see if you can find anything about that. And so it happened. I went back to my office and went in the library at the museum there, and there was a manuscript by a fellow named Mansfield, Colonel Mansfield, who had made a inventory or a visit all of New Mexico military posts in 1853, including a place called Cantonment Berglund. And he drew a map of it, and I saw that, and then I went and got a topographic map, the quarter triangle sheet, to see what creeks came in that direction. One of the creeks was named the Little Rio, and so I went over there and with a map and looked at his map and was able to identify that it had to be this where Pot Creek is. And so armed with this and a diary by one of the officers' wives when she was there, I waited for the call from Rounds from then. In 3 or 4 weeks I went up there and to see Mr. Rounds and went up to the upstairs. He was at the Swiss Chalet that we still have there on the property, and the upstairs was his apartment where he stayed in when he came. The downstairs was the office for the sawmill. So when I parked, he was standing there at the railing, and he said, "You Wendorf?" "Yeah, come on up." So I went up, and we sat down, and we just had a cup of coffee poured. And he said, "I understand you want to have an archaeology field school up here. It's Pot Creek, this ruin behind us here." I said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "And I understand, this is the money you're going to need for that field school?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "I'll do it." And he said, "Now, there's something else I want to talk with you about." So he told me about this cantonment, and he and I went searching for it, and we did find it about 150 yards from his house across the highway was the cantonment was located. Just got out of his car, walked over and picked up a few buttons of the first dragoons and old mule shoes and horseshoes, and the little mounds that you could see out in the sagebrush there were the chimneys.
Stone chimneys.
Stone chimneys, melted down chimneys.
And the rest of the fort had been vertical log post?
Vertical log posts. Very difficult archaeological problem. It's they had rotted off at the ground level, and so all they had left was a ghost of the bark in this thing. So you had to find that wall, and then once you'd found a wall, you could trace it out all right. But we did some digging before we realized how to find those things.
Well, after that, then what happened with regard to Fort Berglund?
Well, Mr. Rounds had a vision. This was in 1956, and Mr. Rounds had a vision that something like they did later at Aspen. He wanted to build a place where people in the arts and the music and sciences of various kinds would come and enrich the intellectual environment of this part of northern New Mexico. And he wanted, he said, "I want to use this grant and make that possible." He had 93,000 acres there. And he, now this vision wasn't put to me right at first, but it was what he, but after we'd found the fort, and I had excavated and restored the first buildings, the big building there at the fort, he made an offer to me. He says, "Let's develop this thing together. Let's take the whole 93,000 acres, see if we can find a good place for a ski slope. See if we have house sites for people. We'll have various kinds of things. And you can turn that big building into a museum." And these were the thoughts he had. And he said, "I'll make a deal with you. I'll put up all the money, and you put up your time, and we'll split the profits." Well, that was an opportunity to be rich, but it also told me how much confidence he had in me.
Yeah.
And but I had to turn it down because all my life I'd wanted to be an archaeologist. And
Not a developer.
Not a developer. And he was disappointed, but he said, "Well, what do you want?" And I said, "Let's take care of this. Let's make this a research center and fix it up and have the facilities and at least get that done, and I'll help you do that." And that's when we started, and we got a couple more houses built. The officers' quarters down at the far end and the commanding officer's house excavated and built. When he died, he was out at Taos and just had breakfast with me and died.
Heart attack.
Heart attack, yeah.
Well, after that, then talk about how Fort Berglund came to be a part of SMU.
Well, when I left Santa Fe to come here, I had been running Fort Berglund after his death, and I saw it out of my hip pocket. Now, you must remember I had a project going over in Egypt and another one going on in Sudan, and I I had a fairly full plate there. I was running a field school in summers, teaching students how to excavate at Fort Berglund. I was also had several large NSF, National Science Foundation, supported grants to do paleo-environmental studies on the high plains of West Texas, doing some of the first pollen studies that have been done in this part of the world, and a few other innovations at that time. And so I had a fairly full plate, and it was the only way we kept it going. Mr. Rounds had left us a small endowment, but it was tied up for several years in what do we call it when they're settling the estate?
Probate.
Probate. But and to keep it going, I had to use the indirects from these National Science Foundation grants, and it was a kind of tough go. Well, I came here from Santa Fe, bringing that with me.
And that was in the year?
That was in the year 1964.
Yes.
And I came here in September '64. And the first thing I did, of course, was do some field schools out there from SMU, and I invited people from the art school and from the geology department and from others to come out and use the facilities and collect a little rent, help us pay the bills. And we had it became obvious that the university community here would be able to make use of that facility. And so Claude and I had some conversation about that. I was a little bit concerned about how overextended I was, and I wanted some relief from having to go after grants in environmental studies in West Texas and New Mexico, and big grants over in Egypt and Sudan, and it was a little more than I felt I could do well. So he said, well, let's get this thing so it's properly taken care of within the university. And that took a little maneuvering, but the people in New Mexico who were on my board, I had an advisory board, they were quite supportive of the idea. They liked SMU, several of them had children here, and they were very pleased with this prospect. Of course, we had to do something with Willis Tate, because I gathered that Allbritton had pulled a couple of things with Willis that he felt was strained him a bit. At least at any rate, when he finally agreed to sign on, and we signed all those papers making this a part of SMU, he looked at Willis looked at Claude. I was standing right beside him and said, now, Claude, is this another one of your goddamn alligator farms?
Well, the Alligator Farm has done pretty well over the years.
Right, it has.
And the agreement that this immediately preceded, I think was, what, a 15-year agreement, 10-year agreement?
15, I believe.
It was 15, which called on the university to discharge certain functions, including financial support, at the end of which the fort would pass in fee simple to the university.
Which it's done.
Which it's done, because the university did meet its obligations.
Yes, it did.
And but you had one last, in terms of the physical plant there, one last significant act, and that was building casitas and the dining hall.
Yes. Well, we had a lot of people out there and we were living in those old lumberyard shacks along the creek there, Pot Creek. And we had bought a lot of surplus Army double bunks, and put them in there. We had plumbed so they had indoor plumbing in them instead of the chick sails outside. But it still was uncomfortable. There was a light bulb hanging down in the center, and there was a lack of, and we had to run 2 and sometimes 3 eating sessions to get everybody fed in the dining hall. We used the downstairs of the chalet as the dining hall and
what
kitchen.
Used to be the office of the lumber company.
Yeah. And we would feed over 100 people in that dining hall. We didn't do we didn't have lunches for the geologists, But everybody else had lunches, and so we had 3 meals a day, some of them times 125, 130 people that we would have there. And it was straining. And I was, and I have to tell you here about another person who played a key role in this thing, and that is our good friend Fred Huster. About the time
Who was in development?
he was a development officer here at the university. I'm not sure what position in development, but he still lives in Dallas, and I hear from him every now and then. Fred came over. He'd heard about Fort Berglund. You know what it was. He came over to my office one day and he said, "Tell me about Fort Berglund." I didn't know who he was either. You know. So we sat down and chatted, and after I had told him all about it as much as I could, by that time I was running Fort Berglund. It was even within shacks, it needed a lot of care and feeding.
Sure.
And I had gone out and gotten myself an airplane. I gotten myself a pilot's license and an instrument rating, and I'd bought myself an airplane. And by that time I had, I think, a Cessna 187 airplane. Eventually got myself a Bonanza and was flying. But I realized I could fly from here to Taos, spend a day there, and fly back and get time for dinner. I'd left early in the morning, about 6. And I could go out there and spend a full day, get in an airplane and fly back and be home in time for dinner. And that was I like to fly. I was pleased that I got the chance to learn how to fly. And so I said to Fred, let's just go out there and take a look at it. So we got in the airplane and we flew out there to Taos, and I gave him the tour around. He said, "My God, Fred, this is fantastic. I've never seen anything. This is wonderful." You know. I really had him. And he said, the university needs to know about this, and they need to develop it. It needs something there. And he said, "What do you want?" And I outlined what I needed in the way of developments: dormitories and dining halls and water supplies and sewer systems and all of those things. And he said, what I'm going to do, I'm going to organize a trip. So I don't know how he did this. But one day he calls me up and he says, "There's going to be a dresser industry planes coming out. It's going to have Bill Clements, it's going to have this fellow and this fellow and this fellow." About 8 of them, I think, you told us here before. And he said, "They're going to come out and land at the airport, and you need to pick them up and get them over to Fort." So I did. I didn't know how a big airplane like that was going to land at that little airport, but it did. And they all arrived about 10 o'clock, and we took them to see some archaeology going on. We had a group of students digging some section in the Pot Creek Pueblo. And then we brought them back over, and we looked around the place in general, and then we brought them back to the compound, and we gave them those margaritas and some 1.5-inch thick steaks. And by the time they were heading back to the airplane, they were singing and having a great time. You move from 500 feet to 7,500 feet and get 2 or 3 margaritas in you, and you're
very relaxed.
Your inhibitions have relaxed a little bit. But Bill Clements fell in love with the place, which he still is. And he called me a few days later, and I think you went along with us. We went out. He said, "I want to go back out there." So we got on his company plane then and flew out to Taos. And he said, "Tell me about what you want to do." And so I told him what I wanted to do. And he said, "Okay, I'll do it." Just like that. And he said, "Now help me find a place to build my house," which I did.
Yes, that was both those trips were memorable. You talk about landing on that short strip at Taos. I was in that plane,
Oh, sure.
and it just barely cleared the east side of the gorge before it hit the end of the runway. And man, that pilot, he caught the last millimeter of blacktop he could find. It was a very interesting landing, and you probably remember that on the Clements plane return home, we had to stop in Santa Fe to fuel. And we had just taken off, and we're just over that pass southeast of Santa Fe, and all of a sudden one of the 2 engines blew. That was a turboprop plane, and there was oil all over the cowling of the engine and all of that. and we were at 16,000 feet. I remember this vividly. And the pilot, who was one of Clement's pilots from the Middle East, because this plane was ultimately destined, it was a new plane, it was ultimately destined for Saudi Arabia, where Clement's Sedco had contracts. And the pilot, I assumed, would turn around and go back to Santa Fe. He said, no, we're going to go either to Amarillo or Albuquerque, and Albuquerque's got better commercial service. We'll go to Albuquerque. And the decline between Santa Fe and Albuquerque, we just barely had enough engine to get to Albuquerque. I don't mean Albuquerque, I mean Lubbock.
Lubbock, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. But
Yeah.
that was a very interesting
Yeah,
fall.
I was a little bit anxious at that time myself, if I remember. Yeah.
Well, as I remember you riding co-pilot with the guy.
I was right there with him.
Anyway, back to substantive things. That was an interesting period, because you personally supervised. You were the foreman for the construction of the 10 casitas and the dining hall.
That's right.
And they were opened in the summer of '74.
That's right.
And that was your last big physical project at Fort Berglund.
Mm-hmm.
And
I stayed on anotro year
as director.
as director, and then
But in terms of the physical plant, I
Yes.
meant.
and I hope you and others understand, in light of some of the things I was telling you that I had going on, that it was running that operation was an enormous responsibility.
Of course, and having had to run it myself
Yeah.
a few years later, I really came to appreciate it. Never had any question about it, and of course by that time I was deaning and doing other administrative things, and there was never any doubt in my mind that you were seriously overextended.
Yeah.
And I thought you made the right decision to put your scientific career ahead of the university's needs in terms of the administration of Fort Berglund and ultimately the Department of Anthropology, to concentrate on your research, because that led ultimately to, what, 37, 38 field seasons in Egypt consecutively?
This will be my 40th coming up.
And because of a number of things, but probably if you had to pick one single thing that led to your election to the National Academy, it would be your work in Egypt.
Oh, I'm sure without a doubt. Although I did receive several awards. I received the Distinguished Service Award from the Society for American Archaeology. I received the Distinguished Service Award from the Society of Professional Archaeologists. I received the Distinguished Service Award from the Department of Interior. I was served for a while. Bill Clements got me appointed as to the Secretary of Interior's Advisory Board, and I was later was chairman of it for 2 years. Mm-hmm. And I received, when that was over, I got a Distinguished Service Award from them. Those were for my work relating to preservation of archaeological sites, and the work that I did in getting the highway salvage archaeology passed.
Your pipeline project.
Pipeline project, my historic shipwreck bill work, and those things. That was cited in the thing, but I think the major point surely is the
Egyptian.
Yeah. Research.
Because that led ultimately to the accumulation of a large body of artifacts, Egyptian artifacts, prehistory,
Yes.
Here, which you have just recently consigned to the British Museum.
Yes, they're now in London. Yeah.
Yeah. And
6 million specimens, and including 100, say, archaic human
remains.
sculptures.
Yeah, and you know, you and I had discussed this many times, and I personally at an institution building level, which I guess I still emotionally am committed to, would have loved to have found a way to keep them here. The responsible thing to do was what you did, because of the tremendous depth that the British Museum has in Egypt.
Well, and they are committed to the preservation of this,
Exactly.
and it is their business. And
right.
unless the university is going to commit itself to doing those sorts of things as part of their goal, it didn't make any sense for them to be.
No, that's right. That's exactly right. And the Dallas Museum of Natural History was in no way in shape. They do not have a program in
Yes.
archaeology now.
No space and given the proper
Space, that's right.
climate control conditions. Now I had other opportunities to place the collections here in the United States, but after considering everything, I felt the collections would be better served and the interests of science would be better served if they were in England, where they'd be readily available to everyone.
More centrally located in many ways for people
Yes.
working in Egypt.
Yes.
Yeah. Let me touch on a couple of other things before we run out of time. You were department chair from 64 here, department chair here from 64 to when did you finally relinquish that?
I think it was 8 years later.
72 or 73?
73, I think it was.
Yeah, yeah. And the Department of Anthropology, with a heavy emphasis on archaeology, really remained almost intact. You lost one or two of the people that came from New Mexico with you, but it has remained a strong, very strong part of the university.
Oh, I think so. I don't know how much is, self-serving vision within yourself, but I think it's an outstanding group, really an outstanding group.
And it has been augmented by the addition of people like Lou Benford and David Meltzer and others in subsequent years.
And you notice, by the way, that Lou Benford is a recent member of the National Academy of Sciences.
Yes.
So he is the second member of the Academy
from SMU. That's right. Which says a good deal about the quality and the quality of the program and the respect in which it is held nationally and internationally, really. Now, one other thing came along in terms of the department, and that was an NSF Department Development Grant.
Yes, it did. Yeah.
And that really put a different spin on the department than it had when it was really just effectively an archaeology department.
Neil McFarland, again, is the person responsible for that. They had an announcement that there was going to be one department, there was going to be another round of, I think, 4 or 5 science departmental development grants awarded nationally, and that SMU could compete for one of those 5. And the university, and I assumed, quite frankly, I assumed that would go to geology. I thought that was a stronger department and it would be one to receive the nomination. And I was floored one day when Neil McFarland called me in and said, we want you to compete for this Science Departmental Development Grant. And I hadn't even done any thinking about it or anything, because I was truly astounded, but honored that he would select us. I think he saw the weaknesses and the strengths, and he thought we would use our strengths to try to build on our weaknesses. And that's what we tried to do. And we wrote I guess a fairly strong proposal. And we got the money. I guess that's what it amounts to. And the department grew rather quickly to 22 faculty members. And
yeah, and you added really effectively for the first time medical anthropology and
social
anthropology.
And we added some areas in physical anthropology. We had 3 physical anthropologists. And, the foundation had a role in helping not decide the people, but helping us decide the kind of people we wanted to have. They too saw that we were primarily an archaeology program, and they didn't want us spending a lot of money
hiring more archaeologists.
Yeah. They wanted us to develop the other areas of our field.
Yeah. Well, it has seemed to me that the university and that period of time was in a very expansive mode. And you had a lot of support administratively from people like Claude and Neil McFarland.
And you.
And later me, perhaps. I certainly tried to be. And without in any way criticizing what has happened subsequently, I've had the feeling that the university which made a considerable investment in a variety of ways in a handful of departments, geology and anthropology, and a few others, economics and so on, is that the university may be in danger of losing some of the dynamism that those programs had in their early years.
Well, I'm concerned for all of us, for all of those reasons. The decision back then to make anthropology a strong department and to give this young boy the rope he needed to hang himself, and to give geology the opportunity to raise its program to a national eminence, is not evident today. They don't have that commitment. In fact, I believe that the way that they evaluate departments now is on the numbers of people that are in the classes. It's a bottom line valuation, which is going to be a little strange in view of the statements that the SMU wants to become a great research university. It cannot ever become a great research university if it takes programs like the one that we have in anthropology, the one that you have in geology. I don't know much about the current economics department, but once they were great.
Yes.
And the statistics department, and systematically strip them or fail to continue to replace strong people, then they'll never become a research university.
This is my strong feeling too, and it's one of considerable concern. And of course, a dimension that came along that helped us both build our departments along with statistics was the Institute for the Study of Earth and Man, and another wonderful gentleman named William B. Heroy.
You bet.
And the vision that he and Claude had for the Institute was that it would be in a position to make the difference in terms of quality growth for those departments that comprised it, and thus help the university. And there have been times in subsequent years when various administrators have viewed the Institute as an enemy rather than a partner. And I think we're through those times now, and I think the Institute, given a little bit more help and time to work through some of its problems, can continue to make a difference with those departments.
Well, I will say that the Institute has been a great help. I will remind you, although I'm sure you don't need to be reminded, that it's only because of you and your help that we were able to bring Benford to SMU, an individual that they take great pride in having here as a member of our faculty. He is widely recognized as the most influential anthropologist of the 20th century. And I think to have someone of that caliber on our faculty is a great asset.
Well, it was...
they do not know, perhaps, that the Institute made that possible.
Well, it was an interesting adventure for the Institute,
yes.
And you're kind to give us credit, and in fact this is one time when I wouldn't even be modest about it because I have the scars to prove it. But I continue to be optimistic that the university's problems that are caused by excessive athletic expenditures and the like that squeeze financially libraries and faculty positions will somehow be corrected, and we'll be able to continue from the sloping plateau that we're on, downward sloping plateau that we're on now with the doctoral and research programs, into one that is at least stable, if not moving upward.
Well, let's hope they turn it around and start up.
Yeah, absolutely.
After all, they were pretty far down when we came in '64.
That's right. They certainly were. You started from, I wouldn't even say ground zero. You were somewhere maybe a little bit minus.
Yeah.
But you have made a great, you and your colleagues have made a great addition to the university and have become an integral part of it. And it's been a pleasure to reminisce with you a little bit about some of these things over this
pleasure.
A period of almost 40 years now.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to discuss these with someone who had such an important part.
Well, thank you. Well, Fred, thank you, and I think we've reached the end of our time, and we can scratch our heads and think of another hour's worth of taping we can do.
Sure, we can do sometime. Okay.